Hello, everybody, and welcome to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and this week we're talking about everyone's favorite podcast topic, complex financial regulations. Graham Ruthven, how excited are you to be here today?
Oh, so excited, Taylor. There is one thing I got into this business for, of football content creation. It was spending at least half an hour talking about financial regulations in the Premier League. Yeah, that's what I live for.
It's what everyone loves. It's the X's and the O's, and then the dollar signs or pound signs or whatever, what have you. We are going to talk about PSR, specifically profit and sustainability rules. We'll talk about some other aspects of financial regulation in the world of football as well. But Graham, we hear about PSR all the time, especially more recently with clubs skirting financial rules or failing to skirt them and getting points deductions and the like. But let's go with the basic starting point. What are PSR rules?
Yeah, so first of all, you
PSR rules.
I know,
PS
I
rules?
find that difficult as well. Everything within me wants to say PSR rules, but it's a little bit like
ATM machine. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ATM machine, exactly the same principle. So PSR, we hear about it all the time. Now, it's become such a key part of the soccer lexicon, especially when it comes to transfers. So we did our transfers update episodes last week. We mentioned PSR a bunch of times. And yeah, it's just become this thing that has reshaped soccer in a way that I think has surprised people. I kind of wonder if it surprised a lot of the clubs that have voted this through, that it has reshaped football to such an extent. And obviously we had FFP, which we'll talk more about that later on. We've had FFP for a long time. But yeah, PSR has become this big thing in English football. And that's the first thing to say is this is a regulation, a bunch of rules that is enforced by the Premier League. So you won't hear PSR talked about in Spain. They have their own thing with salary caps and so on. And FFP is something that relates to all of European football. But PSR, you mentioned it, Taylor, right at the top of the show, it stands for Profit and Sustainability Rules. And basically these are rules to ensure that Premier League clubs spend within their means. And clubs are allowed to make a certain amount of losses over a 3-year period. But if they exceed this limit, they can face penalties. And we've seen that in the last couple of seasons with fines and points deductions. Everton and Nottingham Forest, of course, getting points deducted last season. So this isn't just like an abstract concept. This is something that is really having real world consequences for these teams.
Indeed. I still find myself confused by what those real-world consequences are meant to prevent. Graham, from your understanding, why do profit and sustainability rules come into play? Is it to protect clubs from themselves, or is it to protect the league from certain players having more money than others?
Yeah, it depends how conspiracy-brained you are on this, because I think on face value there was a noble intent to bringing in PSR, which was, so these rules were actually introduced for the 2015-16 season, so they've been in the Premier League for a while now, but of course it's based on a 3-year window, as I just mentioned there, so 3 seasons from that point had to pass until any judgments could be made. And the other thing was COVID, and I was reading Kieran Maguire on this, and Kieran Maguire has a podcast called The Price of Football. I would recommend it if you are interested in this sort of stuff. If you can tolerate more financial regulation chat, then Kieran Maguire is the guy to go to. But he says that unofficially the Premier League was more lenient during that COVID period because clubs weren't receiving ticket revenue and everything stopped for a period in 2020. And so it's only recently that they have truly enforced PSR, and that's how we've ended up with teams getting those punishments. But on surface level, I think the purpose was noble, where when you look at 2015, which is when these rules are brought in and voted through, we'd come through a period in English football where there were a lot of teams who were essentially spending themselves into oblivion. And what would happen is they'd get relegated from the Premier League, they would fall down the divisions, they'd come close to disappearing entirely. So I'm thinking of teams like Leeds United, I'm thinking of Bolton Wanderers, I think Wigan Athletic as well had a similar sort of story. So on surface level, I think it was noble, it was to stop that from happening. But then if you scratch beneath the surface, there is an underlying motive from some clubs who do not want their supremacy to be challenged by anyone willing to outspend them. And so I think that has been I don't know if we're skipping ahead to this part of the discussion, but I think that has been the byproduct, the side effect of PSR is it has kind of established a status quo. It's maintained the status quo at the top of English football.
So you mentioned teams have had penalties, points deductions, Everton, Nottingham Forest last season. Did Everton get 2 different points deductions?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes,
well done, fellas. Way to lead the way.
So they got a 10-point deduction last season, which was then reduced to 6 points on appeal. But to really rub salt in the wounds, the Premier League then gave them a further 2-point deduction. Nottingham Forest, they got a 4-point deduction as well last season. And then Leicester City were also charged for breaking PSR by about £20 million, I think. But they managed to successfully appeal that on the basis that they'd been relegated, and so they argued they were kind of in a grey area between the two leagues, which worked for them in court. And then it's also worth noting that when we're talking about charges against teams, there's obviously the elephant in the room here is Manchester City and the 115 charges against them. It's worth noting that those are technically not PSR breaches. They are something different. They are breaches related to off-the-book payments and sponsorship inflation and a lack of cooperation with the Premier League. So they're not really PSR violations.
So, City clear of PSR for now. We'll see what else they're clear of and how strong that slap of the wrist truly is. For now, focusing on PSR, Graham, let's talk about the basics at present, because I know this is changing. How much money are Premier League clubs allowed to spend, or maybe more importantly, lose each year, and then for that 3-year window?
Yeah, so in the simplest possible terms, Premier League clubs can't have a loss greater than £105 million over 3 seasons. So that's the top line. That's the starting point. Where it gets more complicated, and it does get more complicated, unfortunately, is that there are all sorts of caveats and loopholes within that. So clubs can only lose, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to just kind of read what I've got from a Sky Sports article here, because this is I'm not Kieran Maguire. Clubs can only lose £15 million of their own money across those 3 years. And that includes things that count towards PSR are things like transfer fees, player wages. It could even be things like paying off former managers. So if you're Chelsea and you're still paying, well, Graham Potter will be getting paid by West Ham now, but for a period there, they were paying Tuchel, Graham Potter, Pochettino, and maybe Frank Lampard as well, and their current manager. So yeah, if you're Chelsea and you're paying off a lot of managers at once, then that's going to count towards your PSR threshold. And that is offset against income from TV payments and season tickets and selling players and all that other stuff. Anything above that, up to the £105 million barrier, must be guaranteed by their owners buying up shares. And this is known as secure funding. And that is essentially owners are allowed to subsidise their clubs. So they are allowed to put money into the club. It just has to be done through this mechanism of secure funding through buying up those shares. So there is that mechanism for equity injection. And then to make things extra complicated, because I know that was needed, that equity allowance is less if you have spent any of the past 3 seasons in the EFL. So if you are Leicester's owners, Thai owners, I believe, they are not permitted to put in as much of that equity injection as someone like Todd Bowley, who obviously Chelsea, they've tried their best, but they have not been relegated to the Championship as of yet. So yeah, there's a whole load of caveats and loopholes that clubs and clubs have become very good at finding the different tricks to get around PSR. I mean, I mentioned Chelsea. The thing that they did was the trick of selling academy players, because PSR allows them to put the sale down as pure profit. So I'm thinking of transfers like Cole Palmer's to Chelsea. Obviously, that's coming into Chelsea. Scott McTominay to Napoli in the summer. Chelsea have done it a bunch with. Who else have they done it with? Mason Mount went to Manchester United, of course. So there's a whole bunch of tricks. I think Chelsea as well kind of pioneered the spreading contracts over a longer period of time, because if it's a £50 million player and it's a 5-year contract, you can put that down as £10 million a season. So yeah, there's a number of different ways you can get around this.
Yeah, so a few things here. I think when we go back to the purpose of PSR, we think of the Premier League as this just license to print money. If you're in there, you are doing great. And that is true. You are bringing in a lot of money. However, to stay competitive and to stay in that league, you then have to spend more. You have to increase your branding and awareness and all that stuff. And it ends up being a really expensive endeavor. And that's where I forget the numbers off the top of my head. But we've done 101s about the establishment of the Premier League, about the Super League. And in there, you'll find that since the Premier League founded, an insane in '92, an insane number of clubs have been into administration, or have been bankrupt, or have had financial points deductions, financially related points deductions. It is a massive issue of overspending to kind of keep up with the Joneses, and then especially when those Joneses are Roman Abramovich and the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Abu Dhabi, it's really difficult to remain competitive. And so I think it is, to some extent, a protection against clubs overspending with the idea that, but if we finish in the top 4 with this overspend, then that Champions League bonus makes it all fine. And then if you don't, suddenly you are tumbling down the ranks really, really quickly. I think that is definitely one side of it. I think the other side is to make sure that you can then essentially keep a relatively level playing field. Because if you are trying to tell a club, you can't keep up with Man City, so don't try, you then have to make it like incentivized so that Man City themselves can't spend the way they want to. And I do think that's where some of these controls have come in place, because there were ways to get around it, starting with associated party transactions, which is basically a transaction in which you, the club, are maybe selling advertising space, let's say, to an organization that has direct connections to your owner, which was a way to get around essentially inflating sponsorships. You could get around some of those financial regulations. That loophole has been closed. Amortization is a thing that Chelsea were the kings of, I would say, and remain so, where you're signing this player for an insane amount of money, but you're signing them to an 8-year deal with options and what have you, and then you can spread that transfer fee out over the length of that deal, so you can water down the impact right away because you're spreading it out over so many years. That loophole has been amended, so now I think the maximum you can do is 5 years. Is that correct, Graham?
If you say so. I know they amended it, but I'm not entirely sure what they amended it to.
And then the other one that I think is really interesting when we're talking about loopholes that are theoretically closed or closing, and I think are getting a more highly scrutinized eye, would be those youth player, academy player, former academy player transactions that you mentioned, because they do hit the books at pure profit. And I think the Premier League is not the first to do this. It happens with the Pjanic-Artur swap, I think, where their values are inflated. There is a way that you can utilize that amortization to your benefit. And I'm not saying that's what happened here, but here's an example of how it can happen. Aston Villa, this past summer, bought Chelsea's left back Ian Maatsen. He'd been on loan at Dortmund. Villa bring him in for £37.5 million. They need him. He's going to make their team better. They spend that money. They bring him in. Chelsea, at the same time, acquire Villa's 18-year-old midfielder Omari Kellerman for £19 million. He has played, I believe, 35 minutes in total this season. So why does that deal happen? Now, first of all, you never know. Maybe Kellyman becomes a really important player, so you can kind of justify it that way. But, and again, I am stressing that this is not necessarily what happened here, because it would get them hit with regulations and some pretty highly scrutinized review of their books. The other idea would be, let's say Kellyman's actual value was $7 million, and let's say maybe Chelsea wanted $25 million for Maatsen. So you've got this sizable difference there of about $12 million each, but you can inflate that value with the idea that you are then going to spread it out over the length of the contract. So even if you are technically spending more for the player, you're spreading it out. It's hitting your books at a significantly reduced amount. And then at the same time, because you are now getting, let's say Kellyman was actually worth that 7 instead of that 19, now you're getting an additional 12 million that you can immediately put on your books as pure profit, and that is going to ease those PSR tensions, but it's also going to allow you to spend a little bit more. And I think that is a way that clubs are sort of doing some secondary negotiating to make sure that everything benefits everybody even more so than just signing and transferring a player. So again, that is not necessarily what happened with that swap deal, but there have been a number of these types of deals where a youth player has moved one way just as a bigger name moves the other. And it is, in my mind, a way that teams are either establishing good financial connections or maybe skirting rules for as long as loopholes are closed, or open, rather.
It just seems so murky. And to me, anyway, that's not how the transfer market should work. And if we're looking at how these academy players are all of a sudden so much more valuable because they can be put down as pure profit. I mean, just last week, there was a report that Manchester United were open to selling Kobbie Mainoo because they could put him down as pure profit, despite the fact he's a first-team player. He's one of the very few players in that team that I would say you keep and you build around. And for me, as a fan, an academy player it tethers the club to its community. Those players mean something more to fans, and so for those players all of a sudden to become pawns in these trades, I just find really, really distasteful. And like Chelsea signing, what was his first name? Amari Kellerman? Amari Kellerman. The fact that I had to check that tells you how little he's played for Chelsea. They don't want him as a player. Like, he is purely like a zero on their balance sheet is essentially what he is. And so I just think it's such an impersonal and frankly insulting way to treat people and players.
Two things there, I think, both relate to that sort of game playing. Because the first would be, I don't think this is just my homerism, but when it comes to Mainu and Garnacho, I think if you say everybody in the squad is potentially for sale, it just depends on the amount, people might fixate on those players, but in fixating on those players, Garnacho or Mainu, there is the then awareness that, but they're a homegrown player, so the club is going to want more for them, and they know they can make more off of that sale, so they're going to jack that price up a little bit. And so I think there is an element there of gaming the system, because you're basically saying he's for sale, but you're going to have to pay even more than you would otherwise. And you can sort of make that to your financial benefit. And if a club is spending that amount of money to bring the player in, you would assume it then benefits the player as well. So that is gaming the system. Not surprisingly, I have fewer issues with it, even if I would like those two players to stay at the club. The issue I really have, and maybe this is a silly one, aside from players moving and just feeling like commodities that aren't really of value aside from what they do for the balance sheets and budgets, is on a personal note that, like, we don't know those moves are what they are. And so I think, like, Everton made a couple of these that are maybe now a bit more questionable in my mind. But when I'm doing the Everton season preview, I'm like, oh, they signed this young kid. Like, tell me more about him. Let me read about him. And it's just, it does sort of almost deceive supporters and people covering the team to have this idea that, like, ooh, Chelsea are bringing in this young midfielder for like a good amount of money. Like, they must see some value in him. What is he going to bring to this team? And you spend an amount of time trying to figure out what this youth player is going to do for the club before you realize, like, oh, nothing. That's just a way that they can balance the books a little bit more and make Villa happy at the same time. And those sorts of deals do then remove some of the gamesmanship a little bit. And it's just more about, like, oh, this is just out and out, like, insider trading almost. It just feels a bit sleazier, a bit scummier, a bit more like, oh, now you're talking about like an 18-year-old who you're just moving around because it financially benefits you, than you are like benefiting the player at the same time. Maybe that's a nuanced distinction that I'm only drawing because it's my club, but I still think there is a distinction there in that a high-profile player is still going to come out likely in a better scenario than a kid who's only going to play 35 minutes and probably be kicked out at some point.
Yeah, I mean, the Premier League has a duty to safeguard the development and the welfare of young players in academies. And I don't see how this... I mean, there will be ones that work out, right? Cole Palmer. I mean, Cole Palmer should be a Man City player. He should still be at Man City. He's certainly good enough, clearly, for that level.
Could use him.
They could use him right now. He should be part of their future. Obviously, that Chelsea move has worked out well for him. But for every Cole Palmer, I would bet that there will be like 20 players that you just never hear of, like Amari Kellerman. Maybe he'll come good, but it seems like right now that move was just purely due to the balance sheet.
And if he does, it feels to me like the more likely scenario is like, oh, this guy that we brought in, oh yeah, he's fine, and then like catches the eye of a manager in training. It feels less like there's a sustained program for bringing him in and getting him in with the first team and seeing what he can do, and more of like, if that does happen, it's due to an injury crisis and financial regulations meaning they can't sign players. So here's this kid who's been around. Let's see what he can do. It certainly doesn't feel like it would be part of the plan. It would be anecdotal rather than planned. And I do have some issues there. Speaking of issues I have, Graham, I have a hard time sometimes differentiating PSR versus FFP. Can you draw the distinction there? Because I get a little bit confused. Yeah,
so FFP has, as I mentioned this at the top of the show, has been a thing for a while now. So UEFA introduced financial fair play, which is what that stands for the start of the 2011-12 season. And it is similar to PSR in that it is designed to stop clubs overspending and also faces the same criticism of it protects the elite clubs from ever being challenged from being challenged in a financial sense. And to begin with, FFP was actually more stringent than PSR, so it demanded that clubs break even over a 3-year period, whereas PSR does allow those losses of 105 million. And there was a lot of discussion about how this would impact clubs in Europe, and then what happened was Man City got charged and they were banned from the Champions League. UEFA suspended Man City from the Champions League. They had overspent, they hadn't broken even over a three-year period. And that was the moment, to my eye anyway, that the whole thing crumbled because City appealed, they took UEFA to court, and they won. They did win on a time bar, so they maybe got out of it on a technicality, but they proved that the rules couldn't really be enforced. And since then, FFP has been watered down. So as of 2022, FFP is now the Financial Sustainability Regulations. I wasn't aware that the title had actually changed, and it allows for losses of €60 million over 3 years. So it is still more strict than PSR. There's also a spending limit of 70% of a club's revenue per season, but there's no sense that UEFA actually enforce these because they were stung with the Man City thing. So they are on the UEFA.com website. Whether UEFA is actually enforcing these, I think, is highly dubious.
Yep. But it does sound good for them, and they can then talk about the equality they're promoting and how they're growing the game for all, even if it inevitably is going to lead to their own destruction in a Super League. But you know what? We don't need to talk about that, Graham. What we can talk about is the plans for PSR going forward, because as you said, initially introduced in 2015, there have had to be adjustments due to COVID. There have had to be adjustments along the way to make it work. And I think as situations have arisen in which there have been basically test cases, and I think we talked about that with some of the financial penalties last year, or some of the points penalties last year, it felt like this was a test run for maybe larger issues if and when they arise. How are we going to investigate this? How are we going to apportion blame? How are we going to apportion penalty? And I think it has been an evolving process so far. So number one, would you agree with that? And number two, how do you see it evolving from here?
Yeah, I think an evolution has to happen. So I as I set out, I think the initial intention was noble, to protect clubs, but I also think it is kind of indisputable at this point that it is doing too much to restrict that upward mobility among clubs. And I think Nottingham Forest are a great example against PSR because they got a points deduction last season. They breached PSR, but not because they don't have the money. They have a wealthy owner, and they wanted to accelerate their development after promotion. And yeah, it was a little bit messy to begin with some of the transfers, but now they're genuinely challenging to finish in the top four. I mean, if they'd beaten Liverpool this week, people might have been talking about Forest as title contenders. That's how well they're doing. So it feels like these PSR rules are in a lot of cases just arbitrary, where they're not actually reflective of what a club can and can't spend. And then Newcastle is the other example. Technically the richest club in the world, but they are so limited in what they can spend because of PSR. And they can spend a little. They spent, £60 million on Isak, I think like 30 million on Anthony Gordon. But
50 million plus on Tonali, I think.
Yeah, they've spent money, but that is because Newcastle United actually are quite a big club. So they do have they do have a fan base, they have a large stadium, they do make revenue that allows them a certain ceiling, but they've been banging their head against that ceiling for a couple of seasons now, and PSR is preventing them from. They've got the money. We can talk about the source of that money and the murkiness of the source of that money, but they can clearly spend money without having any kind of financial trouble. It's not like PSR is stopping them from entering financial oblivion, and so PSR puts this artificial limit on them. I've even read articles suggesting that Newcastle have considered taking a points deduction, just overspending, signing a number of players that allows them to grow over a number of seasons, and just taking a points deduction for one season almost as like collateral damage. So I just think that can't be sustainable.
And then it's indicative of the issue, because I've seen those stories too, and then I've seen one of the counterpoints be, but because it seems to be like conditional penalties and points deductions, if you then are overtly doing it, stating up front, like, yeah, we're doing it, we're going to break it, dock us what you want, then that might be where they're like, okay, it's 25 points now instead of 4 points or what have you. So there is that threat, but it is sort of an arbitrary threat. And I think that's what it all goes back to for me, is an issue of control. And it's one that I am sort of conflicted about, because on the one hand, I understand where this is coming from, and I think I see it less, in my mind at least, I see it less as we're saving these clubs and we're protecting them from themselves, and I see it more as we don't want trillionaires and gazillionaires and oil states and what have you to come in, buy these clubs, put a ton of money in, and make this league less competitive. I think a lot of it is basically that, like, when Man City do that in the beginning, or Roman Abramovich does it in the beginning, which is a weird thing to say about, like, the early 2000s, but, whatever. I think it's seen more of like, all right, if that's what you want to spend your money on, like, sure, you can dump a bunch of money into this league and into a team if that's how you want to go. And then suddenly when that becomes really successful, allows people to sports wash, allows people to kind of grow their cultural footprint, but also clubs to become incredibly competitive and win the Champions League and win the Premier League. I think then the powers that be see that as like, wait. This is no longer a kind of oddity where like you're just dumping money into it and it's a lost cause. Now suddenly this is a really financially important and globally known brand that we have to preserve because there has to be competitiveness and we can't have everyone owned by an oil sheik or the like. And so then the regulations come into play. And I think on the one hand, I like not having certain clubs have this insane advantage, but I'm also aware that I support a club that has its own financial advantages. And then these regulations do sort of cap things in what feels at times like an arbitrary way, because to your point, you have clubs that could be spending a ton more, and that's like almost literally like the change in their couch cushions would be the difference in the financial penalty or the financial amount they would have to spend. And so it just gets murky really, really quickly, because I understand where these rules come from. But at the same time, it feels a little bit like closing the barn door with the horses already gone, or whatever the expression would be, that like the door is sort of already open. Clubs have already benefited from this, and it now feels like you're doing a lot of work to try to deal with issues that are sort of the issues of 10 years ago. Well, new loopholes and new issues are already arising. It just feels like a really difficult thing to manage, hence the need to evolve. And we are getting that with new rules and percentages and the like coming into play, I believe. Next season, there will be more regulation, more anchoring in connecting the amount you're allowed to spend to the lowest, I think TV revenue, is that what it's all connected to now?
The revenue, it might just be the TV revenue, actually, of the bottom club in the Premier League. So that there's a tethering
centralized
between
broadcast and commercial deals. So basically, I think the advertising revenue coming from the Premier League, essentially, the percentage that the lowest club gets combined with the percentage of the TV deal that the lowest club gets.
Yeah, and we'll see how that works in reality, because I'm sure PSR in its original form sounded good as well when it was proposed, and obviously in reality, I think it's been anti-competitive for the Premier League. I think you have clubs like Nottingham Forest and Aston Villa and Newcastle. They have succeeded over the last few seasons in spite of PSR, not because of PSR. They have money. They have the money to spend more on their team and not really be in trouble. So I am in favour of some kind of basically what you want to do, right? And coming up with a mechanism that does this is where this is tricky. Basically, you want your Man Cities and your Manchester Uniteds and your Liverpools and your teams at the top to be limited in some way in what they can spend. So you don't just have Newcastle coming in and spending like £3 billion one summer on transfers. But equally, you want a mechanism where the teams at the bottom are allowed to accelerate their development, where they are allowed to, if they have a rich owner, wealthy owner, they can put £200 million into a transfer window without it coming back to bite them in some way. If they have that money, that's where there does need to be some form of monitoring of this. But coming up with a mechanism that puts that down on paper is the tricky bit. And also you need the Premier League clubs to vote this through. So why on earth would Man City vote through a mechanism that limits their spending if other clubs further down the ladder are not limited in the same way? So this is difficult.
I think that has been also a sort of backfire to some extent, because I think the assumption was the smaller clubs will all back this. The larger clubs like Man City and Newcastle are going to be the ones who are the most annoyed about it and the most kind of inclined to fight against it. But in reality, I think plenty of the smaller clubs who would like to be able to spend more than they are allowed to spend find this a hindrance to their development and overall stability. I don't know if the new changes that we talked about are going to rectify things fully. I think they might end up making things worse. And we should clarify, it is not as though, let's say, Sunderland, who are currently fourth in the championship, let's say they win the playoff, they get promoted. It is not like Man City will only be able to spend that amount that Sunderland are able to spend from the commercial and broadcast deals. They would be able to spend a multiplier of that amount based on their finish in the table. So there still would be the inequality and difference in spend, but I think that is meant to seek to establish more control and more, I think, standardization across the approach. But I still I think I understand where it's coming from. I understand why it is useful. I still think it doesn't get the job done because it creates these scenarios like we're talking about with Newcastle, where like I don't have sympathy for a club that are owned by Saudi Arabia. Like, whoa, they're beyond champagne problems, even if they can't have champagne. But like Sandro Tonali is an example of this for me, where they spend all that money to bring him in. There is no way that they could have seen the betting scandal that happens and the suspension that then follows. And I think back to like Roman Abramovich when he first takes over Chelsea. If one of his players were suspended for a year, he signs 2 players to replace them, because what happens if the replacement gets hurt? And we'll deal with the consequences later. Whereas with Newcastle, a player that is suspended for a year through no fault of their own, they weren't incentivizing the betting or anything like that. Now they have to eat that financial penalty, and it completely limits their development as a club. It completely limits their plans going forward. Again, having sympathy about a £50 million transfer is a bit rich, but it still does seem illogical to penalize a club and really overall hurt their books, and then you're risking having to sell off academy players. We talked about that earlier and the impact that can have. It means that you're not able to bring in other players to help balance the squad. It means that you're spending in areas that you didn't plan to, and it can throw everything out of order. And it's just it's unintended consequences once you start trying to regulate those loopholes, I think. But it makes for a murkier situation that then ultimately benefits the rich, because they can navigate them with those lawyers that are willing to charge $50 million to find that time bars have occurred.
Yeah, the starkest example for me with Newcastle is Alexander Isak, who has grown to the point where he's potentially the best striker in the Premier League at the moment. And actually, I don't think Newcastle would sell him. But there's always this suggestion that maybe they would sell him for the right price, because what they could do is they could then reinvest that money in other areas of the squad. And if you break that down to like a human discussion, like imagine you're Newcastle United, Taylor, and I'm discussing with you, okay, so you're thinking of selling Alexander Isak. Why are you thinking of selling Alexander Isak? Well, it's because, we'd be able to reinvest other areas of the squad. All right, you're short of cash. No, we're the richest club in the world.
Yep.
What? That's where that doesn't make any sense at all. So
yeah, and I think, like, again, it is maybe drawing a line that is fully arbitrary. But I think if that were like a Barcelona problem of like, yeah, you did this from your own like malfeasance and like just short-term planning, I would have less sympathy for it. But when it is a sort of club that had who was their terrible owner for so long?
Sorry, what club are we talking about here?
Newcastle
United, Mike Ashley.
Yeah, like they suffered through Mike Ashley for so long, where he is cost-cutting and bleeding that club and just turning what could be one of the more lucrative clubs in the world into what they were for so long, which was almost like a relegation yo-yo club. Like, it's just insane then that you are putting them in this position to some extent where they have to have kind of those problems, whereas they could be becoming one of like the top teams in the league. It feels very arbitrary to me, and is one that I still understand where PSR has an impact and why it's here and what it is meant to do. I just don't think it's doing it as well as it could be or well as it should be, maybe.
Yeah, one of the things Newcastle are trying to do is so infrastructure spend is not counted in PSR, which is why across the Premier League, this isn't a coincidence, across the Premier League there is a lot of stadium redevelopment happening. So Spurs obviously have their new stadium, but even like Aston Villa I think have plans to expand their stadium. Newcastle are currently in like a consultation phase where they're deciding whether to expand St James's Park, which by the way is already quite a large stadium. They might also build a new stadium. So this is like clubs taking a long-term look of a long-term view of how to kind of raise their PSR ceiling. Is if they have larger stadiums, they can sell more tickets, they can create more revenue, they can sell more hospitality packages, and so yeah, that kind of explains why there is a drive across the Premier League. I mean, Liverpool have expanded their stadium, Man City have expanded their stadium, Chelsea are looking for a new stadium, Newcastle are doing it, Old Trafford apparently is getting redeveloped. Not a coincidence, that is linked to PSR.
So is that a positive then? Like, I think we've been somewhat negative to very negative on my side. Like, do you see positives, Graham, that we haven't maybe addressed or haven't given as much weight to?
I mean, the big positive is those days of Leeds United and Bolton and Wigan. I mean, I wouldn't get complacent because obviously the EFL has a different set of rules. but it doesn't seem like, it feels like we've come out of that moment where there was a club every few months in English football and in the EFL that was going bust. So that is the positive, I guess. In its like fundamental purpose, it has achieved stability for these clubs. It's just very heavy-handed, and it needs a bit more nuance, I think.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think long term, it is reasonable to assume that at some point, like, clubs won't have this backing. Owners will pull out. Owners will have less of an interest in owning a sports club and kind of increasing their brand that way. And then you do run that risk of what happens when the billionaire backer pulls out and quits putting money in. You run into massive financial problems right away and almost guaranteed insolvency. And so I do think if you see it as a long-term plan for making sure that clubs and the league remain intact, I think that there is maybe more value than I am giving it. I still just think it ends up feeling like a thing that is selectively pursued. I don't think we always get the clarity because obviously clubs are not going to make their books openly available to the public. It ends up just feeling a little bit murkier, a little bit selectively applied. And I think when there's already, even if they are unconnected, those 115 charges against Man City, it really quickly feels like, are you just policing the clubs that maybe will go along with it, that you feel like you can get? Or are you really policing everybody equally and it's only those smaller clubs that are the ones in violation? That feels less likely to me than maybe the ones that are less able to be litigious are the ones that you have more control over versus ones who will meet you with an almost literal army of lawyers.
I think the lack of transparency is a big thing in the public discourse, because to take us back a bit to that story with Kobe Mainu and Garnacho, I'm sure when Manchester United fans, well, Taylor, when you read that, surely your concern is, Manchester United are in PSR trouble here. And then the PSR deadline, which actually passed this week, and it was a deadline where the Premier League would hand out any kind of punishments to clubs for that had breached PSR, that came and went, and there were no punishments. So it's a little bit confusing at times, and I think I talk about this with MLS. The chatter around transfers and player trading and so on is almost a sport in itself, and so I think the Premier League needs to be careful not to muddy or cloud the waters too much there, because that's a huge driver with Premier League clubs and interest. Is this team going to sign this player? They're in for this player. Newcastle are in for this striker. If you suppress that too much, I think that will be detrimental to the Premier League's brand, frankly.
All right, well, there we are, Graham. We've gone plenty long on PSR, Profit and Sustainability Rules. I don't think I did PSR Rules again after the introduction. I hope that is the case. Anything else to add, or shall we say we have 101 of this one successfully?
I think we 101 the heck out of this one. 37 minutes of financial regulation chat.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I think there was some emotion in there as well. More emotion than I expected for an episode about PSR. I think it ends up, anything that is immediately confusing and requires a lot of Googling just to understand one tiny aspect of, I think, starts to make me feel slightly out of touch and slightly like I can never be in touch with the sport that I love. But this episode and this show always help me feel at least a little bit more in control and aware of what's happening. So thank you for that, Graham Ruthven, and for your appearance and work on today's episode.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell.
Listeners, thank you all for your listening on this episode, or viewing, I guess, if we're posting these clips. Graham, where are we on the video component of 101? You know these things, so we just throw you under the bus real fast.
101 will be going on the new Total Soccer Show YouTube channel, so that the link to that channel will be in the show notes. You'll find it on our social media as well, or just by searching on YouTube. So yeah, if you want to see what the faces of two guys having to get their head around PSR and financial regulations look like, head to our YouTube channel.
There we go. Thank you all again. Check out the YouTube channel. We'll talk to you next week.